Hello, Imperfect Leaders, and welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Joe Santana. And if you tuned in last week, you learned about ERGs, employee resource groups, and how they contribute to every type of organization. And Joe told us about the difference between signals and noise when I asked him about organizations being subjected to opposition from some policymakers when it came to diversity and inclusion and equity work. And so if you haven't listened to it yet, please go back to last week's episode first, and then come on back to this one. In this episode, Joe participates in an after-action review, and he talks about a decision he made and what he learned from that decision. It's such a good episode as well. Thanks for tuning in. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Joe Santana, and Joe is the chairman of CDO Power Circle, the creator and host of ERG Power Talk podcast, and the author of Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG/BRG Strategy. So in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. So Joe, what happened?
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier before we started this, I've had my share of good and bad decisions. I always think of my good decisions as being the moments to celebrate, and my bad decisions were my learning opportunities. And one of my most recent learning opportunities came just a few years ago. I'm in my 5th season of my podcast, ERG Power Talk. But when I first started this whole idea that led to the podcast eventually, my idea was to create a means of democratizing education, training, and development for ERG leaders. In the past, in order for an ERG leader to learn and to develop their skills as a leader, they had to go to a conference, and there they would listen to speakers. And let's face it, organizations were not going to send all their ERG leaders to this. And there's always the concept that, well, we'll send Joe and Peter, and when they come back, they'll share what they learned with everybody else. Never happens, because Joe and Peter, in addition to running an ERG, also have day jobs. So you get sucked right back into all the work that you have to do. So unfortunately, there were people that had this role, which is an important role that helps the organization, who weren't trained at all. There was no investment made in developing them or teaching them how to be better leaders. So I thought, I want to tackle that. I think that's important, because if we develop more skills in these people, we're going to be able to leverage that. It's going to affect people, it's going to affect the company, communities, etc. So my initial idea was, let me get together some really high-performing thought leaders who are chief diversity officers, who have demonstrated and expressed a tremendous capacity and willingness to teach and develop others. And let me work with them to put together learning curriculums that have to do with what these ERG leaders need, and at the same time, skills that they'll be able to use later on when they get larger scope jobs. That was the initial idea. In fact, I gave it a name. It was called Turbocharge Your ERGs. I went out, I bought that name, turbochargeyourergs.com. I bought a website for it. I started working on it. I spoke to a couple of organizations that decided to put some money into it, and we were all getting ready to go. About 2 or 3 months into it, I realized that it was becoming clear that the people that I needed to record these programs were the busiest people on the face of the earth. I couldn't get them. And so I tried different ways. I tried, maybe I'll write most of the script. You tell me what it is that you want your script, and I'll write the script out for you. But even with that, they missed deadlines, they missed dates, they couldn't. And it wasn't because of lack of interest. It was just because of the sheer amount of time. A lot of times people don't realize when they say yes to something that they don't live inside a vacuum. They already have a lot of their dance card filled out, and they're just adding more stuff to it, right?
We often refer to it as your plate is actually a platter and your platter is actually full.
Exactly. The platter was completely full. So now I'm thinking, well, how am I going to get around all this? And at a certain point, I went back to the basics again, and I said, okay, my initial idea was to provide training and development in a democratized form for ERG leaders. And now where I'm stuck is that I decided how I want to do that. And I'm finding that how I want to do that is full of various types of pitfalls, primarily the schedules of the people that I want to work with. So how do I get around this? And what I, came up with was the idea of, and by the way, I'm a podcast listener as well as a podcast host. And at the time, when I run, that's when I listen to podcasts. And as I was thinking about this, I was going for a jog and I'm thinking like, well, what about this? I mean, I can't be the only person in the world that uses my exercise time to listen to podcasts or my drive time. Maybe this is the vehicle. So I went back to the people that I had spoke to before and who had invested in this. And I said, listen, I think that we all want the same thing, but we're finding it impossible to do it the way we originally wanted to do it because the intent is there, but it's just the time and the energy. What about if instead we ran this as a podcast? I would host it. Not only would I have you, but I could bring in other thought leaders that I know, authors and experts in various areas that could provide insight and ideas. And we could record that and make it available to ERG leaders. And you as investors, your ERG leaders could be an audience in the background. So for your members, for the members of your organization, it becomes an encounter with a thought leader where you can ask that thought leader your own questions, pose what some of your challenges are, get feedback. But for everybody else in the community of ERG leaders, at least the piece where I'm interviewing the thought leader that gets captured in the recording, that could be offered as a podcast. And they love the idea. They said, sure, let's do that. It does work. We realized that we wanted to do this, but the time doesn't allow it. And we repackaged the whole thing. I changed the name. I sort of like considered the investment in turbocharger ERGs as an interesting experiment. I changed it to ERG Power Talk Podcast, and the rest is history. Podcast took off, more members came in, I got better and better guests on the podcast and so forth, and the rest is history. But it all came from that pivot and realizing that, you know what, I could still do what I want to do. The what is still possible. It's the how that I can't make work. And there is where I need to pivot on the how. So my decision that went south, but then we kind of boomeranged back up.
So I'm going to back us up. You did such an amazing job of walking through all of my questions, but I'm going to sort of force you to kind of go through them a little bit again, if that's all right. So if I understand correctly, one of the things that you recognize there's a problem when you do professional learning, trying to convene lots of people together to do this learning together, is that not everyone's available, nor do the organizations or corporations send everyone to those trainings. They send one or two people. They say, we're going to do a train the trainer kind of thing. You'll come back, you'll train everybody. And as you noted, that doesn't always happen. In fact, if there is some convening together to talk about what you learned, it's very surface, sort of, let us just tell you how great it was, but we don't really have time to do and dig into it. So you thought, why don't I create some modules that will be designed and written by thought leaders in the ERG community who will then be able to do this work with others so that they can elevate their learning and continue this good work. And then it seems that what got overlooked was people's schedules, that they already didn't have time for additional work. And they certainly didn't have time, even though their intentions were, we want to do this, but we just can't make it all work in terms of scheduling. And so you, and I'm going to use the word that all superintendents will now turn off this podcast because we don't use the word pivot anymore after the pandemic, because every school board around the nation told us to pivot. Everything we were pivoting. So I'll call it a mid-course correction so that they stay with us. So that there was a mid-course correction done, which was, I'm going to create a podcast that will allow thought leaders to engage with me sort of as the facilitator. Although I think you've done something different from other podcasts in that you have ERG members present so that they can participate in terms of being present, as well as those who are listening on their own time, right? Because you can opt into a podcast at any point so that they can further develop their leading and their learning. Am I capturing that pretty well?
Yeah, you got it, Peter. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so then when I think about what got overlooked, you stated one thing clearly. Were there any other items that you felt were overlooked as you were making these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major thing that I overlooked was the scheduling piece, the fact that people are well-meaning, but a lot of times it's kind of like, hey, let's do lunch. But then we discover neither of us has the time or are in the same city long enough to do it. So the intention was there. It wasn't done out of hypocrisy, but the ability to do it is not there. So that was certainly the big piece, and just pulling everyone together. And Peter, I will tell you that in addition to that, I found that increasingly, with people becoming busier and having more and more things to do, that the ability to provide information and to meet asynchronously has become more and more important. So a lot of times when we have meetings now, what I do, and I have other meetings that are not part of my podcast with my chief diversity officers. When I have meetings with my chief diversity officers and we have a guest who's a thought leader, could be a CEO or someone else who comes to join us in the meeting to talk about some particular topic of interest, we record those. And then after I record those, I put them in a synchronous meeting platform and I make them available. So when they get the email, there's a link there, but there's also a little window inside the email that all they have to do is click on it, and it begins to play segments of that discussion. And on that platform, they have the opportunity to send me back and other members comments, like, for example, I have a question about this, or I'm doing something like this in my company, but we're doing it this particular way. So literally what we're able to do is we're able to meet so that I put that information out there at 10 o'clock in the morning. Peter comes in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and he comments on it. And then I see it again at 4 o'clock. So we are asynchronously communicating in this private space and having this meeting and discussion about this presentation. So that's one of the things that I've learned today, is that in order to get people engaged and involved, you must find ways to work through the little gaps in their schedule and to make it convenient for them to jump in and jump out, because very few people have an hour or 2 hours to just sit there in one meeting and then another. They're already, to your point, not only is their plate full, that plate is on a platter that's full, and they just don't have the time.
I was just recently listening to a podcast by Sixth Street, which is a hedge fund, an equity firm a private equity firm in San Francisco, and they were interviewing an individual within city government. And that point that you just made in terms of whether it's public education or public government, and I imagine even in the private sector as well, you're constantly being invited to lunches. Nobody really has 2 hours anymore to sort of sit and dream and think. They're moving from piece to piece. And so often you arrive at a meeting without an agenda. So that is another piece that I remember. It was one of my takeaways from that conversation. You said something that was really interesting to me, which is that superintendents around the nation are considering how they move initiatives forward. And a part of that is trying to get everyone together. And what a great idea to have those meetings recorded so that others can access them in an asynchronous manner and then provide feedback so that that movement forward is not stunted by the fact that everyone is busy. So what a great example. What about relationships? What new relationships were formed, or what did you learn about relationships as you were making this mid-course correction or just throughout this experience?
I mean, I think relationships and expanding your relationships beyond your immediate circle are a key to just personal growth and being able to make those mid-course corrections. Because in many cases, you'll run into other people who just, like, for example, I said that I was basically jogging and listening to this podcast. But if I peel it back and I think about the different conversations that I was having with different people, one person is a sound engineer that I used to do some of the work on my podcast. Another one was another executive in another space that was talking about some of the issues that they were facing, very similar to what you were just talking about now, that People want to do stuff, but we can't get all 10 of you together in the same room for, an hour on a particular day or for 2 hours on a particular day. The, those different pieces of information that were coming into my radar literally just came together while I was going for that jog and listening to the podcast. And I had my little aha moment. And I think that's true of everyone. I think that leaders need to expand their circle of their relationships to other people with different perspectives, with different experiences. Because what you consider to be that aha moment that comes to you in a flash is really the culmination of your subconscious working on all these little drips and drabs of conversations that you're having. Because in the back, while you're running or doing something else, your brain is working on things like, how do I deal with this particular thing, this pesky thing that I'm dealing with right now that I can't get past? And those little drips and drabs of information become really important in helping you to come up with new solutions. So I think it's vital to keep expanding our circles. And I used to do this exercise, Peter, that I think it's a great exercise for anyone to do, because basically LinkedIn is just such a great tool for this. I would go into my LinkedIn profile, and I would look at it on a regular basis and ask myself, how many people do I know and how many people am I connected to that have a different background from me, that are in different professions? So maybe there's some academics, and maybe there are some business leaders, and maybe there are some people in HR, and there are some people. And I did this on purpose because I wanted to make sure that my network was as diverse across as many dimensions as possible so that I could get all those great ideas from different people. Now, one of the things that I found when I was speaking to large groups a lot, and in many cases, I would ask them to pull out their LinkedIn profile and go in there and look in that area where it shows your network and your network composition. And if you're in HR and 90% of your network is in HR, you live inside a bubble. If you're an accountant and 90% of the people that are connected to you are other accountants, you live in a bubble. It sounds like that Jeff Foxworthy.
No, don't say it.
Right? No, I won't.
But if 90% are superintendents, you live in a bubble, right?
You live in a bubble. You're living in a bubble. The best ideas actually come often from people that are in adjacent areas or different professions who are looking at things in a different way. Because a lot of times you have a lot of people that come from the same background. They're looking at the problem. They went through the same training, probably in close proximity universities with similar professors, learned the same models, and they're trying to solve the problem, and they all get to the end of the puzzle, and it's like, oops, we're stuck. Whereas, unbeknown to them, somewhere else, that puzzle's been solved already. It's just in a different environment or in a different silo. But you could take that information, repurpose it, and use it. So for leaders, and this again talks back to the need for diversity. For leaders, the more exposed you are to a diverse group of people, diverse in their life experiences, diverse in their careers, diverse in the path that they took to get to those careers, the better off you are, because the more inputs you have and the more that'll lead to those aha moments that enable you to grow and transcend and move on to the next level.
So in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience?
I think one of the things that I've learned from this experience and others is the idea that you need to look at what you're doing in terms of, is it taking you in the direction that you want to go? And if it's not, what are the other options that are available to you? What else can you do? How can you improve or enhance your ability to reach whatever objective it is that you're seeking to reach? And that's not easy to do, I think, especially within what I'm going to call our culture, our American Western base culture that we live inside of, because we live in a culture where generally the idea of grit, the idea of stick-to-itiveness is really, the religion. We have coaches that say things like, for example, winners never quit and quitters never win. We have plays and theater productions that extol the idea of sticking with it. I remember I went to this Broadway show several years ago. This has been off Broadway for a while now, called Starlight Express. And the show was all about
roller skates. Skates.
Yeah, it was roller skates, but it was all about these. The theme or the plot was you had all of these trains. Some ran on coal, some ran on diesel, some ran on electricity, and they were competing with each other for who was superior. And obviously, electricity was the more modern one. But the lesson behind the whole thing was that the lowly coal-run train, which literally was an old technology, stuck to his guns and stuck to this idea that coal was going to make a comeback, that coal was going to be the way for them to succeed. And I forget the exact outcome of the show, but it was the coal train was the heroic train. And again, this is so American, so like, the hero sticks to their guns, doesn't give in to pressure to change, and just keeps at it with grit and eventually emerges, successful. And there are some cases where that might be true. But the bottom line is that there are moments in every leader's life where they have to look at what they're doing and ask themselves, should I continue to pursue this, or should I cut bait and move on to something else? In my case, with the idea to educate ERG leaders and make it more democratic and more available, my goal was to provide that service. The vehicle that I chose to do that was not really working, so I made a switch. And I think that switch, that ability to know, using the old gamblers' terms, know when to hold them and know when to fold them, I think becomes increasingly important today, especially with all the changes that are going on. So I don't want to say the P word that you told me turns off all the superintendents. So what I'm going to say is that you have to become a master of when to make that mid-course change, and it becomes increasingly important. In fact, in the past century, it was actually noted, I think there was this Forbes magazine article that was out that showed that there were a lot of organizations that had these tremendous plans that they put together, these strategies that they put together. And they would execute the strategy, but at the end of the year, they wouldn't end up getting the benefit that they thought they were going to get. Not because they executed poorly, but because the underlying conditions shifted and all they were doing was moving along with the same plan. So they were basing everything on their original strategy instead of realizing all the emergent things that were going on around them that called for them to make a mid-course correction. So I think that's a skill that leaders need to really master, because in today's fast-changing environment, I think mid-course correction is just going to become, something that people do on a regular basis or need to do on a regular basis.
My guest again was Joe Santana, the chairman of CDO Power Circle, and he's the creator and the host of ERG Power Talk podcast, as well as the author of Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 tips to power up your ERG, BRG strategy. You've really given us some opportunities to think about how leaders can really think about how to leverage an ERG for the benefit of their organization, their employees, and most importantly, the children that they serve. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It was my pleasure being here.
So there you go, part 2 in the books. Thank you so much for continuing to be a dedicated listener to this podcast. Now with over 1,200 monthly downloads in over 25 nations, we just keep growing, and that's because of you. So thanks for tuning in. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.